What's the most awkward, bizarre, or trashy wedding you've attended? Story 1. I once went to a wedding where the groom got so drunk before the ceremony that he had to be carried down the aisle. His groomsmen propped him up like a marionette while the bride, looking furious, whispered, "Just say I do and shut up." He slurred his vows, almost fell over during the ring exchange, and then, right after they were pronounced husband and wife, he puked all over her dress. The bride shrieked and stormed off while his best man held him up and said, "Well, guess we're going straight to the honeymoon, buddy." The reception still happened, but the groom passed out in the bridal suite. The bride partied with her side of the family, refusing to acknowledge his existence. They're divorced now. Story 2. This wedding had a no kids allowed rule, which was fine, until the bride and groom showed up with their 3 children. They explained that their kids were part of the aesthetic and symbolized their union. It got worse when the bride's sister showed up with her newborn and was told to leave immediately. The bride caused a full-blown scene, shouting, "I told you, no kids. Our kids are the exception because this is our day." The sister, holding her crying baby, burst into tears and left. Half the family walked out with her. The groom tried to calm the bride down, but she just kept screaming about how entitled people were. The best part? The DJ played "We Are Family" as everyone awkwardly ate in silence. Story 3. I went to a wedding where the groom gave the most horrific speech during the reception. He stood up, looked his bride in the eye, and said, "When I first met you, I honestly didn't think you were my type, but over time, you kind of grew on. Like, I figured, why not? You were persistent, so I figured I'd give it a shot." The whole room went dead silent. The bride looked humiliated. Then he kept going. And now, here we are. I mean, I still have doubts sometimes, but, I think we'll be okay. The bride excused herself and her mom ran after her. The guy just laughed and sat down. I later found out that the bride left the reception early and stayed in a hotel alone. The marriage lasted less than 6 months. Story 4. The ceremony was in a Dollar Tree parking lot. Not a cute, Pinterest-style outdoor wedding. Just a literal parking lot with foldable chairs and a cheap arch decorated with fake flowers. Right before the ceremony, the groom's ex showed up in a wedding dress, claiming that she was actually his real bride. She kept screaming about how he had proposed to her a week ago. The groom, looking way too guilty, said, "I was drunk. It didn't count." The bride snapped. She ran at the ex, tackled her to the pavement, and they full-on wrestled while the groom tried to break it up. Eventually, the cops were called, and the ex was taken away. You'd think that would be the end of it, but nope. The bride went through with the wedding like nothing happened. The groom was still out of breath from the fight when he said, "I do." Story 5. The couple decided they wanted a wilderness wedding. Cool, right? Except instead of picking a venue, they told all their guests to hike 3 miles up a mountain to the ceremony site. People showed up in formal clothes, completely unprepared for the trek. Grandparents were gasping for air, women in heels were tripping over rocks, and one groomsman had to carry the maid of honor on his back. When we finally got to the top, sweaty and exhausted, the officiant announced that the couple was running late because they took a wrong trail. We waited 2 hours in the sun, no water, no food. When they arrived, they were also covered in sweat and just went, "Who's ready to celebrate?" The reception? Another 2-mile hike downhill. Story 6. The wedding ceremony started off normal, until the groom's side of the family got blackout drunk before the reception even began. During the vows, the groom's uncle stood up and interrupted the officiant, yelling, "You sure you want to do this, buddy? Marriage is a prison." The bride shot him a death glare, and someone dragged him back into his seat. Then came the first dance disaster. The couple had a cute, choreographed routine, but the groom's mother, absolutely hammered, decided she needed to have the first dance with her baby boy. She stormed onto the dance floor, shoved the bride aside, and clung to her son like a koala bear. The groom, clearly embarrassed, tried to pry her off, but she started crying hysterically, screaming, "You're leaving me for her!" The DJ awkwardly faded the music out while guests just sat there in stunned silence. The bride disappeared into the bathroom for the next hour, and the groom spent the rest of the night trying to calm his sobbing mother down. They're still married, but the bride refuses to attend any family events with her mother. Story 7. This wedding was supposed to be a beautiful beach ceremony at sunset. The couple had hired a local preacher, set up an arch, and arranged rows of white folding chairs in the sand. But they didn't reserve the beach. So halfway through the vows, a group of drunk spring breakers wandered over and started blasting music right next to the ceremony. The officiant tried to talk over "Shots, shots, shots" by LMFAO, but the couple was visibly losing their patience. Then, the real chaos hit. Some random guy in a Speedo strolled into the middle of the ceremony mid-vows and shouted, "Hey yo, congrats, my dudes. Now who's ready for a keg stand?" The bride turned beet red and started crying. The groom just walked away. He didn't even finish the ceremony. He just left the beach, got into his car, and drove off. The wedding was canceled on the spot. The guests just stood there, unsure of what to do, while the bride had a full breakdown in her wedding dress. Story 8. The couple was obsessed with gaming, which is fine, but they decided their entire wedding should be Minecraft-themed. Everything was pixelated. Square decorations, cube-shaped cakes, and even green creeper centerpieces. Instead of wedding vows, they exchanged lines like, "I promise to protect you from creepers and keep our love forever enchanted." The best, worst part? The groom was in full cosplay. He dressed as Steve from Minecraft. Blue blocky outfit, foam pixelated sword, the whole thing. The bride wore a normal dress but held a Minecraft torch instead of a bouquet. Then, halfway through the reception, the groom got on the mic and challenged his groomsmen to a PvP battle. They set up computers in the corner of the venue and started playing Minecraft while the guests just sat there awkwardly, waiting for the bride and groom to do something together. The bride looked miserable. She spent most of the night alone while the groom was too busy mining diamonds with his friends. They divorced after 8 months. Story 9. This wedding featured an actual WWE-style brawl between the groom and his new father-in-law. Tensions were already high because the bride's dad hated the groom. During the reception, the dad kept making passive-aggressive toasts, like, "To my daughter, who always had high standards, but I guess love makes us do crazy things." The groom sat there seething. The last straw came when the bride's dad jokingly handed the groom a prenup in front of everyone. The groom lost it. He lunged across the table, tackled the father-in-law, and started swinging. The two men rolled across the dance floor, knocking over chairs and sending the cake flying. The bride was screaming, and the DJ just shut off the music in horror. Security had to break them up. The bride stormed out, and the reception ended early. The marriage didn't last a year. Story 10. This couple thought it would be fun to have a Renaissance fair wedding. Guests were told to dress in medieval costumes, even if they didn't want to. The bride dressed as a princess. The groom, a knight in full armor. The officiant, a wizard. The entire ceremony was in Shakespearean English. The groom said, "Milady, I doth taketh thee as mine own." The officiant cast a fake spell to bind their souls for eternity. Then came the worst part. Instead of a first dance, they had a jousting tournament. The groom's friends rode bicycles at each other with foam lances, while guests just stood there, confused. Dinner? No utensils. Guests were handed giant turkey legs and told to feast like peasants. The bride's grandma, who wasn't warned about the theme, was horrified and left early, saying, "I thought this was a wedding, not a circus." People left before dessert because they couldn't take the weirdness in. The couple loved every second of it. They're still together, but no one brings up the jousting wedding at family events. Story 11. I once attended a wedding where the bride literally ghosted the groom at the altar. Everything was going smoothly until the officiant said, "Do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The bride paused. She looked at the groom, looked at the crowd, then turned on her heels and walked away. No explanation, no speech, just left. Everyone sat there in stunned silence. The groom's face went from shock to devastation in real time. His mom started wailing. The best man awkwardly patted his back like, "Bro, what just happened?" The bride's family also had no idea what was going on. Her dad ran after her, but she just got in her car and drove off. Later, we found out she had been having doubts for months and just couldn't go through with it. Instead of telling anyone beforehand, she thought she'd just see how she felt in the moment. The groom? Completely blindsided. He stayed at the venue drinking alone while everyone tried to figure out if they should still eat the catered food. The worst part? Her mom apologized to everyone on her behalf, but the bride never did. Story 12. This wedding was an absolute financial disaster. The couple was broke, but instead of budgeting wisely, they decided to have a luxury wedding with no way to pay. First, they sent out GoFundMe links with their invitations, asking for wedding donations. When that didn't bring in enough, they started charging guest admission. Yes, they sold tickets to their own wedding. $50 for a basic seat, $75 for a seat with a good view, $150 to be in the wedding photos. Most people thought they were joking, until they showed up and got turned away at the door for not paying. During the reception, the groom made a toast thanking everyone for helping fund our dream wedding. Then he added, "And if anyone hasn't paid yet, our Venmo is still open." The bride followed it up with, "And tips are welcome." Half the guests walked out. And no, they never refunded anyone. Story 13. The couple decided that instead of a normal wedding, they wanted to get married at a tattoo parlor. And instead of exchanging rings, they'd tattoo each other's names on their faces. I wish I was kidding. The entire ceremony took place inside a dingy tattoo shop. Guests sat on folding chairs next to tattoo stations while the couple stood in front of a neon skull sign. When it was time for the exchange of rings, they each took turns getting each other's names inked on their cheeks. The bride flinched halfway through, and now her husband's name is permanently crooked on her face. The groom, drunk off cheap beer, thought it would be funny to get her name in Comic Sans. When the tattoos were done, the officiant said, "You may now kiss the bride, just avoid the fresh ink." The worst part? They broke up 3 weeks later. Story 14. This wedding turned into a full-blown food fight. The bride and groom thought it would be hilarious to have a cake smash battle instead of a normal cake-cutting ceremony. They each grabbed handfuls of cake and started pelting each other with it. It started playful, until the groom smashed an entire plate into the bride's face. She, in turn, threw an entire tier of cake at him. The guests thought it was over, until the groomsmen joined in. Suddenly, it was cake war. People started ducking under tables as frosting and chunks of cake flew across the room. An elderly guest got hit square in the face with a chocolate cupcake. The bride's mom got cake in her hair and started screaming. By the time it ended, the entire venue was coated in icing, and the venue owner was furious. They got banned from the venue and lost their security deposit. The guests spent the rest of the night picking cake out of their clothes. Story 15. The groom's speech at the reception completely ruined the wedding. Instead of a heartfelt message, he decided to go full stand-up comedy roast. "Wow, I really never thought I'd settle down. I mean, I dated hotter girls, but hey, personality matters too." People laughed nervously. The bride forced a smile. Then he kept going. "I mean, she's not the best cook, she nags a lot and she takes forever to get ready. But you know, I guess love means accepting flaws." The bride's face dropped. Her mom whispered something to her, and she just stood up and walked out of the reception. The groom laughed, thinking she was joking, until she never came back. The marriage lasted all of 2 weeks. Story 16. I once went to a wedding where the bride got into a fistfight with the groom's sister. The tension had been building all day. The groom's sister hated the bride and made snide remarks nonstop. During the vows, she fake coughed when the bride said, "For better or worse." During the first dance, she rolled her eyes dramatic, but the real explosion happened during the bouquet toss. The bride playfully aimed the bouquet at one of her friends, but the groom's sister snatched it midair and shouted, "Guess I'll be next." The bride, furious, said, "Give it to someone who actually got invited." The sister responded with, "Maybe if you weren't a gold-digging hag, I'd respect you." Then the bride lunged. In full wedding dress, she tackled the sister to the ground. The two of them rolled across the dance floor, pulling hair and throwing punches. The DJ cut the music. The groom tried to break it up, but his bride accidentally elbowed him in the face. Eventually, the bride stormed out screaming, "I'm done!" She and the groom left in separate cars. They still got married, but the sister was banned from all future family events. Story 17. The couple thought it would be romantic to have a hot air balloon wedding. It sounded dreamy at first until it went horribly wrong. Only the bride, groom, officiant, and 2 witnesses were allowed in the balloon. The guests were left watching from the ground as they exchanged vows midair. Right after they were pronounced husband and wife, the wind picked up. The balloon drifted off course, faster than expected. The pilot started yelling, "Hang on! This wasn't supposed to happen." The guests on the ground freaked out. The bride was screaming. The groom was laughing like a lunatic. They ended up landing in the middle of nowhere, about 10 miles away from the venue. By the time they got back, the reception was half over. The bride looked windblown and miserable. The groom? Still laughing. People still talk about the wedding that almost floated away. Story 18. This wedding had the worst best man speech in history. The best man got up, clearly drunk out of his mind. He swayed a little, took a deep breath, and said, "Man, I never thought I'd see the day this guy settled down. Seriously, he used to be a total player. Like, remember that one time in Vegas? Or Miami? Or that girl in—" The groom cut him off. "Dude, stop." But it was too late. The bride's face was stone cold. The best man, oblivious, kept going. "Anyway, I mean, we all know this isn't gonna last, right? Haha. But hey, let's drink while it's still fun." The room went dead silent. The bride got up and left. The groom ran after her. The best man? Still chugging beer like nothing happened. The reception ended early. The best man was kicked out. And the groom? Had to beg for forgiveness for weeks. Story 19. The couple decided to have a potluck wedding. Instead of hiring a caterer, they asked guests to bring their own food. But it had to be on theme. The theme? Exotic fusion. No one knew what that meant. Some people brought sushi tacos, others brought spaghetti with kimchi, and one guy just showed up with a giant pot of boiled eggs. The bride's aunt accidentally gave half the guests food poisoning because her Thai-inspired chicken had been sitting in her car all day. People were running to the bathroom mid-toast. At one point, the groom's grandpa vomited into a potted plant. The bride cried. The groom apologized nonstop. The wedding ended 2 hours early, with guests leaving pale and clutching their stomachs. Story 20. The groom's ex-girlfriend crashed the wedding, in a wedding dress. No one knew what was happening at first. The ceremony had just started when someone in the back shouted, "Wait!" Everyone turned around, and there she was, in a full wedding gown. She marched up the aisle, pointed at the groom, and yelled, "This should have been US." The bride looked shocked. The groom looked horrified. Before anyone could react, she grabbed the microphone from the officiant and launched into a speech about how they were soulmates, and he was making a huge mistake. Security dragged her out, kicking and screaming. The ceremony continued, but the bride's mood was completely ruined. They got through the wedding, but they divorced within a year. Turns out, the groom had still been texting his ex all along. Story 21. This wedding literally ended in fire. The couple wanted a rustic barn wedding with lots of candles to set the mood. The entire venue was covered in dried hay and wooden decor. The ceremony went fine, and the guests were settling in for dinner when the best man knocked over a table centerpiece, a candle. At first, it was just a small flame, but the hay on the floor caught instantly. Within seconds, a fire started spreading across the barn. The wedding planner ran in yelling, "Everyone get out!" Guests screamed and scattered, some grabbing their plates of food as they ran. The bride's dress caught a small ember, and a groomsman had to pat her down to stop it from burning. The best part? The groom tried to save the cake instead of his bride. He ran back in to grab it, screaming, "I paid $600 for this." By the time firefighters arrived, half the barn was gone. The reception was canceled. The couple had to explain to the venue owner why their wedding literally burned the place down. They're still together, but their wedding photos now include a fire truck in the background. Story 22. The groom forgot his own wedding date. Everything was set, venue booked, catering ordered, guests invited. The bride spent months planning the perfect day. But the groom? Turns out he was completely clueless. The morning of the wedding, the bride called him, asking where he was. His response? What wedding? He had completely forgotten, thought it was next weekend, was still in bed in his boxers. The bride, furious, screamed into the phone while guests started arriving at the venue. His groomsmen had to drag him out of bed, throw him into a suit, and rush him to the ceremony. He arrived 45 minutes late, disheveled, and half awake. Instead of a touching vow, the bride glared at him and said, "At least you finally showed up." The guests laughed nervously. The marriage lasted 6 months. Turns out he also forgot their anniversary. Story 23. This wedding turned into a family brawl, with the bride leading the charge. The couple had bad blood between their families, but they thought, "It's our wedding. Everyone will behave." They were wrong. At the reception, the bride's uncle made a sarcastic toast, saying, "Well, at least she found someone who can tolerate her." The bride's brother stood up and yelled, "What did you just say?" Within seconds, chairs were knocked over. The groom's cousin threw a drink at the bride's aunt. The bride jumped into the fight herself, launching herself at her uncle. The groom just stood there, horrified. The best man tried to break it up and got punched in the face. Someone called the police. By the time officers arrived, 3 people had black eyes, 2 tables were broken, and the wedding cake was on the floor. The bride had to be pulled away while still throwing punches. The groom filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Story 24. The bride tried to turn the wedding into a reality TV show. She hired a full camera crew to follow her around all day. The guests weren't told about this, so they were blindsided when they arrived to find boom mics and cameramen in their faces. The bride acted like a diva the entire time. She kept yelling "cut" during the vow so the cameras could get a better angle. She made her bridesmaids repeat their entrance 3 times because she didn't like how it looked. The worst part? The reception was delayed 2 hours because the bride wanted a dramatic dress change and demanded that all guests cheer louder for the cameras when she entered. People started leaving early, annoyed that the wedding felt more like a bad TV pilot than a real event. The groom? Completely embarrassed. The reality show idea never got picked up. The couple divorced within a year. Story 25. This wedding turned into a funeral, literally. The bride's grandma passed away during the ceremony. It started during the vows. Grandma, sitting in the front row, leaned over and slumped in her seat. At first, people thought she was just dozing off. Then the bride's mom started screaming. The officiant stopped mid-sentence. The guests jumped up in panic. Someone checked for a pulse and yelled, "Call 911." Paramedics arrived right away, but it was too late. The bride collapsed into sobs. The wedding immediately turned into a mourning session. Instead of a reception, people gathered in shock. unsure what to do. The groom's family tried to continue the wedding, saying, "She would have wanted you to go on." The bride? Absolutely horrified. The couple postponed the wedding, but never actually rescheduled it. The stress was too much and they broke up months later. Story 26. This wedding was a multi-level pyramid scheme in disguise. The couple had been deep into some business opportunity, but no one thought they'd turn their own wedding into a recruitment event. The first red flag? The invitations included a QR code with the message, "Come celebrate our big day and discover how you can achieve financial freedom." At the reception, instead of a first dance, they played a PowerPoint presentation about how their new business could make everyone rich beyond their dreams. The maid of honor looked horrified. The best man hid his face in his hands. The final straw? During the gift opening, the couple handed out business pamphlets and said, "Instead of gifts, we'd really love if you invested in our company." Guests left immediately. The couple? They went bankrupt 6 months later when their business turned out to be a scam. Story 27. The groom forgot to break up with his side girlfriend before the wedding. Everything seemed normal until the reception. The guests were dancing, drinking, having a good time when suddenly a woman stormed in, wearing a red dress, holding a crumpled invitation. She walked straight to the DJ and took the mic. "Hey everyone, I'm the groom's girlfriend. Or at least I thought I was." Dead silence. The bride looked confused. The groom looked like he was about to vomit. The woman held up her phone and said, "We were together 2 nights ago. Want to see the texts?" The bride didn't say a word. She just picked up the wedding cake and threw it at the groom. Guests scrambled to get out of the way. The DJ shut off the music. The groom tried to explain himself, but his bride had already left the building. The annulment? Filed the next morning. Story 28. The couple tried to have a skydiving wedding, only for the bride to refuse to jump at the last minute. The idea was extreme sports romance. The entire wedding party was supposed to jump out of a plane and land on a scenic field, where the officiant would marry them on the spot. The problem? The bride, terrified of heights, had only agreed to this to impress her groom. When the time came to jump, the bride froze at the plane's door, sobbing. The groom, already in midair, had no idea. So while the guests cheered, expecting both of them to land together, only the groom landed. The bride was still on the plane, crying hysterically. The pilot had to fly her back down, where she arrived a full hour later, shaking and embarrassed. The wedding still happened, but the groom never let her live it down. They divorced a year later. Story 29. The bride hired an exorcist mid-reception because she thought her groom's grandma was possessed. It started when the elderly woman, who was just tired and slightly confused, began talking to herself at the dinner table. The bride, already a little superstitious, whispered to her maid of honor, "Something's not right with her." After a few drinks, the bride became convinced that the grandma was carrying a dark spirit. So, without telling the groom, she called a local spiritual healer. Imagine everyone's shock when a man in robes walked in, pulled out incense, and started chanting. The groom flipped out. His grandmother, who was just trying to enjoy her meal, burst into tears while the bride tried to banish the evil. Half the guests walked out. The groom called off the marriage that the bride, she still swears she felt something off. Story 30. This wedding ended with an arrest because the groom stole the wedding rings. The couple had bragged about how they had the most expensive rings anyone had ever seen, but no one knew how they afforded them. Right after the ceremony, the police showed up at the reception. 2 officers walked up to the groom and said, "We need to speak with you outside." Confused guests watched as the groom was put in handcuffs. Turns out the luxury rings? Stole. He had taken them from a high-end jewelry store and was caught on security cameras. The cops had been tracking him for days. The bride screamed at him while he was being dragged away, still in his tuxedo. The guests? Stunned. The reception? Cancelled. The honeymoon? Spent in jail. The bride? Filed for annulment within 24 hours. Story 31. This wedding featured a bride who faked her own pregnancy and got caught at the reception. The bride had announced her pregnancy a few months before the wedding. She claimed it was a surprise blessing and told the groom, "Let's get married before the baby arrives." The groom, thrilled at the idea of being a dad, rushed the wedding. Fast forward to the reception. The groom's aunt, a nurse, was chatting with the bride and casually asked, "So how far along are you?" The bride hesitated. Then the aunt said, "Oh, you're barely showing. Can I feel your belly?" The bride froze. Then she laughed nervously and said, "Oh, the baby's really small right now." The aunt, suspicious, pressed a little harder on her stomach. That's when something shifted. Turns out the bride had been wearing a fake pregnancy belly. The aunt, not one to hold back, yanked up the bride's dress slightly, revealing a foam belly strapped around her waist. The entire table gasped. The groom, standing nearby, turned white as a sheet. The bride burst into tears and ran away. The groom filed for annulment that same week. Story 32. This wedding had a full medieval sword fight between the father of the bride and the best man. The couple had a medieval-themed wedding, which was fun at first. Everyone dressed in knight, princess, and wizard costumes. But the bride's dad took things a little too seriously. He was furious that his daughter was marrying someone beneath her and had already been drinking heavily. During the best man's speech, the father of the bride suddenly stood up and declared, "I challenge thee to a duel for my daughter's honor." The best man, who was just trying to toast the couple, laughed it off. But the bride's dad? Not joking. He pulled out a real sword, because of course he brought one, and swung it at the best man. The best man, terrified, grabbed a prop sword from the decor and defended himself. Suddenly, there was a full-blown sword fight in the middle of the reception. Guests screamed. The bride begged her dad to stop. Security tackled him. The wedding continued, but the bride hasn't spoken to her father since. Story 33. The groom's mom wore a white wedding dress, identical to the bride's. This woman was obsessed with her son. She hated the bride and made it very clear she thought no one was good enough for her baby. But nobody was prepared for what she pulled at the wedding. As guests took their seats, the groom's mother walked in wearing a full-length white gown, lace, train, veil, everything. At first, people thought she was joking. Then she walked down the aisle, right before the bride. The bride stopped dead in her tracks. The groom looked horrified. The mom stood next to him smiling, like she was the one getting married. The bride's family freaked out. Before anyone could stop her, the mother grabbed the mic and said, "I just wanted my son to know he always has a choice." The bride, done with the nonsense, turned to her groom and said, "Either she leaves or I do." The groom escorted his mother out himself. They still got married, but the groom's mom wasn't invited to the reception. Story 34. This wedding got ruined by a mechanical bull. The couple wanted a country-style wedding at a barn venue. For fun, they rented a mechanical bull for the reception. It seemed like a great idea, until the bride's grandmother got on. At first, she was laughing, waving her hands in the air. Then, the operator, a groomsman, thought it'd be funny to turn up the speed. The bull jerked wildly. The grandma went flying. She landed flat on her back and broke her hip. Cue ambulances, screaming relatives, and absolute chaos. The bride? Hysterical. The wedding? Over. The reception never happened. And now, the family refuses to speak to the groomsman who turned up the bull. Story 35. The groom left his own wedding because his favorite sports team was playing. This guy was obsessed with his football team. Like fantasy league, tattoos, watches every game religiously obsessed. His bride thought, he wouldn't be that bad on our wedding day. She was wrong. Right before the ceremony, the groom kept checking his phone. His team was playing a championship game at the same time as his wedding. At the reception, instead of mingling with guests, he set up a projector to stream the game. The bride? Livid. Then, in the middle of dinner, the groom got up and left. Like, walked out. He told his best man, "I just gotta watch the last quarter at the bar next door. I'll be right back." He never came back. The bride waited for an hour, then gave up. When the groom finally returned, drunk and celebrating his team's win, he found his bride's ring sitting on the table. She had left. The marriage lasted one day. Story 36. The bride's father sold her wedding dress without telling her. The bride had a dream dress, a gorgeous custom-made gown she had saved for 2 years to buy. It was the centerpiece of her wedding. But 2 days before the wedding, she went to pick it up from her parents' house, and it was gone. Her father had sold it. Why? He owed money and figured, it's just a dress, she can get another one. The bride collapsed in shock. She screamed, cried, begged him to tell her where it was. Turns out he had sold it to a random woman online. When the bride tried to contact her, the woman refused to give it back. The bride had to buy a last-minute dress from a department store, and she was miserable the entire wedding. Her father wasn't invited to the reception. The worst part? She never got her dream dress back. Story 37. The groom hired a stripper for the bachelor party, and she turned out to be his fiancé's cousin. The bachelor party was supposed to be a tame, no-drama event. The groom swore no strippers, no wild antics. His best man didn't listen. He surprised the groom with a stripper, a woman in a mask and lingerie who danced on him in front of everyone. The guys cheered, filmed, and laughed. The groom, embarrassed, played along. Then, as she was leaving, she took off her mask. It was the bride's cousin. The room fell silent. The groom turned pale. The cousin screamed, "Oh my God, you're the groom!" The bride found out within an hour. She stormed into the party, threw the ring at his head, and called off the wedding on the spot. The best man got banned from her family forever. Story 38. The couple had a destination wedding, but forgot to check if the venue was legal. The bride and groom wanted a dream wedding in the Caribbean. They invited 50 guests, spent thousands of dollars, and planned every detail. Except one. The venue wasn't licensed for weddings. They found out on the wedding day when the officiant said, this isn't legally binding. The guests thought it was a joke. The bride laughed nervously. Then the officiant showed them the paperwork. The venue had never been licensed for legal marriages, just symbolic ceremonies. The couple freaked out. They tried to find a courthouse or a legal officiant, but it was a holiday weekend. Everything was closed. The guests, who had spent thousands traveling, were furious. The groom's parents demanded refunds. The couple had to fly home and get married at a courthouse the next week. The dream wedding? Completely meaningless. Story 39. The bride's ex crashed the wedding, disguised as the photographer. The bride had a crazy ex-boyfriend who never got over her. She had a restraining order against him and hadn't seen him in years. But somehow, he found out about her wedding. Instead of showing up uninvited, he got creative. He hired himself as a second photographer under a fake name. The real photographer thought the groom had requested a second shooter, so no one questioned it. For the entire ceremony, the ex was standing just feet away from the bride, snapping pictures of her. No one noticed. Until, during the reception, the real photographer went to introduce himself and had no idea who the second guy was. The ex, realizing he was caught, bolted. Security chased him through the venue. He jumped a fence and vanished. The bride? Shaken. The groom? Furious. They never found out how he pulled it off. Story 40. The wedding cake was filled with maggots. The couple had ordered a custom cake from an artisan bakery that specialized in unique flavors. The bride wanted a passion fruit lavender vanilla cake. It arrived looking gorgeous. The guests took photos, complimented it, and waited eagerly for the cake cutting. Then came the night. The groom cut the first slice, only to reveal maggots. Hundreds of writhing maggots crawling through the cake. People screamed. The bride threw up. The bakery hadn't properly stored the cake. The exotic ingredients spoiled, attracting insects. The guests? Traumatized. The couple got a full refund, but refused to eat cake at their anniversary years later. Story 41. The bride faked a medical emergency to force the groom to stay with her. The wedding had been rocky from the start. The groom had been having doubts for weeks, and the night before the wedding, he almost backed out. But the bride sensed it. So, during the reception right after the first dance, she suddenly collapsed to the floor, clutching her chest. People panicked. The DJ cut the music. The groom rushed to her side. She gasped. "I can't breathe. I think I'm having a heart attack." Ambulances arrived. The groom was hysterical. Guests cried. Then, at the hospital, doctors ran every test imaginable and found nothing. Turns out the bride had faked the whole thing. When confronted, she admitted, "I knew you were going to leave me, and I needed you to feel like you couldn't." The groom filed for divorce a week later. Story 42. The bride's dog ate the wedding rings hours before the ceremony. The groom had left the rings on the bedside table at their hotel. Their Great Dane, who they insisted on bringing to the wedding, snatched them up and swallowed both. Panic set in. The best man Googled, "How long does it take for a dog to poop out a ring?" The maid of honor called a vet. The vet's response? "You have two choices. Wait for nature to take its course, or we do surgery." The couple decided to wait. So while guests arrived, the best man followed the dog around with a plastic bag, praying. The ceremony was delayed 2 hours. Finally, success. The best man retrieved the rings, cleaned them aggressively, and the wedding continued. The guests knew nothing. The bride still wears that ring today. Story 43. The groom got into a fistfight with his own father. It started at the reception when the groom's dad got drunk and started making jokes about the bride. "She's a pretty girl, but let's see if she can keep my son happy." The bride ignored it. The groom? Tense. Then the dad said, "Well, we all know she wasn't the first choice." The groom stood up and told him to shut up. His dad laughed and slapped him on the back. The groom punched him square in the face. Cue chaos. Chairs knocked over. Guests screaming. Security dragged the dad out. The groom wiped the blood off his knuckles and said, "Let's cut the cake." The bride pretended it never happened. The groom and his father haven't spoken since. Story 44. The entire wedding was a scam because the priest was fake. The couple wanted a budget wedding and found a cheap officiant online. Big mistake. The guy showed up dressed as a priest, did the whole ceremony, and collected his payment. But when they tried to file the marriage certificate, it got rejected. Turns out the priest was a random dude with no credentials. They tracked him down, but he had vanished. No social media, no phone number, no real name. The couple had to redo the entire wedding, legally. Half the guests refused to come again. The second wedding? A courthouse with just the two of them. Story 45. The maid of honor confessed her love for the groom in the middle of her speech. Everyone thought the speech would be sweet. The maid of honor was the bride's best friend for 15 years, but then she started getting emotional. She looked at the groom and said, "You're the love of my life." Silence. The bride froze. The groom looked panicked. Then the maid of honor burst into tears and ran out. The reception was awkward as hell. Guests didn't know what to do. The bride? Livid. The maid of honor was never heard from again. Story 46. The bride's mother-in-law changed the wedding venue without telling anyone. The couple had booked a beautiful lakeside venue months in advance. Everything was planned, paid for, and ready to go. But the groom's mother hated the location. She thought it was too modern and wanted something traditional. So, behind their backs, she canceled the reservation and booked a completely different venue, a church an hour away. The couple found out on their wedding day. Guests were calling, confused about where to go. The florist delivered flowers to the wrong place. The cake melted in the sun at the original venue. The bride was furious. She confronted her mother-in-law, who smiled and said, "I just knew you'd love my idea more." The bride almost called off the wedding right there. The groom didn't speak to his mother for months. The reception? A mess. Half the guests never made it. The mother-in-law still acts like she did them a favor. Story 47. The wedding DJ had a full-blown meltdown into the microphone. At first, he seemed fine. Played the right music, made the introductions, kept things moving. Then, during dinner, he got weird. He picked up the mic and said, "I just want everyone to know. I should have been a famous musician. But instead, I'm here. At a wedding." Again, guests looked at each other, confused. Then he continued, "Do you people even appreciate good music? You just want to hear Uptown Funk for the 100th time." The bride tried to wave him off, but he wasn't done. He ranted for 10 more minutes about his failed music career, his ex-wife, and how he deserved better than this. Finally, the groom's uncle grabbed the mic from him and said, "All right, buddy, time to go." The DJ stormed out, taking half the sound equipment with him. The rest of the wedding? Silent. No music, no dancing, just awkward conversations. The couple got a refund. The DJ got banned from wedding gigs. Story 48. The bride's ex sent a fake pregnancy announcement just to ruin the wedding. The bride had an on-again, off-again ex who had always been manipulative. When she got engaged, he flipped out. Told her she was making a mistake. She ignored him and moved on. Or so she thought. On the morning of the wedding, her phone blew up. The ex had posted on Facebook, "I wasn't going to say anything, but since he's marrying someone else today, I just want him to know I'm pregnant with his baby. Congrats to the happy couple." The groom saw it first. He turned white as a sheet and asked, "Is this true?" The bride screamed in frustration. She hadn't spoken to her ex in over a year. She tried to prove it was fake, but the damage was done. Some guests left early, assuming the worst. The bride spent half the reception making calls to clear her name. The ex ? Admitted later it was a lie. But the wedding? Completely ruined. Story 49. The wedding cake collapsed, right on top of the bride. The couple had ordered a massive 6-tier cake from a well-known bakery. It was the bride's dream cake. White fondant, real flowers, elegant design. But the venue was too hot. As the reception started, the cake began leaning. The baker had warned them that a cake this tall needed to be kept cool, but the couple insisted on displaying it for hours. During the cake cutting, the bride went to cut the first slice, and the whole thing toppled right onto her. Her dress? Ruined. Guests? Gasping. The groom? Trying not to laugh. The worst part? The bride's mother-in-law whispered, "Well, maybe it's a sign." The bride walked out and refused to come back. The marriage lasted 3 months. Story 50. The groom forgot to book the honeymoon and lied about it until the airport. The bride had been dreaming of their honeymoon in Greece for years. She trusted the groom to handle the flights and hotel since he insisted he had it all covered. Big mistake. At the airport, they got to the counter and the airline had no record of their reservation. The bride looked at her husband in horror. He stammered, I was going to book it later." She asked, "What do you mean, later?" Turns out he had never booked anything. No flights, no hotel, no plans. The bride burst into tears. Instead of Santorini sunsets, they spent their honeymoon in a budget motel, fighting. The trust? Gone. The marriage? didn't last a year. Story 51. The bride's sister was secretly pregnant with the groom's baby. The bride and her sister had always been close. They did everything together. And the sister was even the maid of honor. Everything seemed perfect until the reception. During the best man's speech, the sister suddenly stood up, shaking. She grabbed the mic and said, "I can't do this anymore. I have to tell you the truth." Everyone fell silent. Then she blurted out, "I'm pregnant, and it's the groom's baby." The bride went pale. The groom stood up, stammering, "It happened before you guys got engaged. I thought he would pick me." The room erupted in chaos. The bride threw her bouquet at her sister's face. The groom tried to explain, but the bride walked out and never came back. The wedding? Over. The marriage? Didn't happen. The groom and the sister? Tried to make it work but broke up before the baby was even born. Story 52. The couple hired a food truck instead of a caterer. Then it drove away mid-reception. The couple thought they were saving money by hiring a trendy food truck instead of traditional catering. The truck was supposed to stay for 3 hours serving gourmet tacos and burgers. Instead, they served food for 45 minutes, then packed up and left. Guests were still waiting in line when the truck pulled away. The bride ran after them, yelling, "Hey, you're not done." The driver rolled down his window and said, "We ran out of food. Contract's over." Half the guests didn't eat. People were stealing leftover bread rolls from the appetizer table. The worst part? The couple paid in full, no refund. The bride cried in the bathroom while guests left early to go to McDonald's. Story 53. The groom's ex crashed the wedding with a baby. Everything was going smoothly until the reception. Just as the couple finished their first dance, the door swung open, and in walked the groom's ex, holding a baby. She marched straight to the microphone and said, "Congratulations, but just so you know, you forgot something." The groom's face? Pure horror. The bride? Frozen. The ex handed him an envelope, a paternity test. Guests gasped. The groom tried to deny it, but the ex held up the paper. "You are the father." The bride stormed out. The groom tried to chase her, but she threw her bouquet at his head and left in her wedding dress. The marriage never happened. The groom now pays child support. Story 54. The officiant forgot to file the marriage license, and no one found out for a year. The couple had a gorgeous wedding. Everything went perfectly, and they started their life together as husband and wife. Or so they thought. 1 year later, the bride went to update her passport, only to find out she wasn't legally married. Turns out, the officiant forgot to submit the marriage certificate. The bride called the courthouse. "Can we fix it?" The clerk told her, "Ma'am, there is no legal record of your marriage. As far as the state is concerned, you're still single." Cue absolute panic. The groom laughed it off, until he realized that meant all their legal benefits were invalid. Worse, the officiant had retired and moved out of the country. They had to remarry at the courthouse, but the bride was so angry she almost didn't go through with it. Story 55. The groom's mother wore a black veil and treated the wedding like a funeral. From day one, the groom's mother hated the bride. She called her a gold digger, claimed her son was throwing his life away, and even tried to convince him to call off the wedding. When that didn't work, she showed up to the wedding wearing head-to-toe black. Not just a black dress, a full mourning veil, black gloves, even a small framed picture of her son from childhood, like he had died. During the vows, she sobbed dramatically and whispered, "It's like losing my baby forever." The officiant tried to ignore it. The bride? Fuming. Then came the final straw. During the reception, she gave a toast. "To my son, who has been taken from me today, may you find peace in your new life, without your real family." Guests were mortified. The bride grabbed the mic and said, "You know what? You're right. He's free now." Then she dragged her groom outside and told him to choose, her or his mother. The groom chose his wife. The mother-in-law banned from their house forever.